Welcome to the next e-CENS video to reveal why switching from Universal Analytics to GA4 requires time and resources. Hi, I'm Holger Tempel, partner at e-CENS, as well as the founder and managing director of e-CENS in Germany. In the last video, I've showed the differences in campaign tracking when you want to switch from Universal Analytics to GA4. In this episode, I'll talk about the differences between interaction hits in Universal Analytics and event hits in GA4. And just to be clear, they're not that fundamentally different. So let's discover the real differences together and therefore take a closer look at how data is sent to Google Analytics. Basically, data is sent to the Google Analytics endpoint via request by involving the tracking code, no matter if it's Universal Analytics or GA4. Sending data is done by appending additional information with parameters to this request. And these parameters are key value pairs, which, as the name implies, consist of a key and a value each. Those are appended to the URL of the request either with a question mark for the first parameter or an ampersand for each subsequent parameter. But how can you examine the data being sent to Google Analytics in more detail? To do so, you need to involve the developer tools of your browser. And for demonstration purposes, I'll recommend using the Google Store in the US, since this website is tracked with both Universal Analytics and GA4. To make sure that you will definitely start browsing as a new user, the site should be opened in an incognito window. But before opening the Google Store, you must open the developer tools of your browser by hitting F12 on your keyboard. This will either open the developer tools within your existing browser window or in a separate window. My recommendation is to always use them in a separate window. Once done, open the Google Store in your incognito browser window and you will see the Developer Tools window will be updated. Then simply click on Network to see the client-server communication. Next is to enter the word collect in the filter field, which will show entries containing this pattern only. Once done, the list will be updated immediately and you will see those lines containing the pattern only. And this reveals the first obvious difference between hits sent to Universal Analytics and GA4. Hits sent to Universal Analytics will always contain the key value pair v equals 1, while hits sent to GA4 will always contain the key value pair v equals 2. So now let's examine the anatomy of a hit being sent to Universal Analytics first. To do so, search for the line which also contains the key value pair t equals pageview and click on it. The tab Headers will then display the requested URL, including all parameters which have been appended. This represents the data which is sent to the Google Analytics endpoint. In addition, the request is sent via the GET method. Switching to the tab Payload will then show all parameters line by line. But even though it's easier to read the payload now, the meaning of the parameters is still some kind of cryptic. So let's demystify the most important parameters for Universal Analytics. And I'll start with the protocol version, which is represented by the parameter v, and its current value is 1. This value will only change when there are changes made which are not backwards compatible. Next is the tracking ID, which is represented by the parameter TID. It always starts with UA- followed by the Universal Analytics account ID, followed by minus, plus the number of the property. So all data being collected will be associated with this particular ID. According to GDPR and also other data privacy regulations, there's a need to anonymize the IP address for the user's browser. This is specified in the parameter AIP. And the cache buster is represented by the parameter Z and is used to send a random number in GET requests to ensure browsers and proxies don't cache the hits. These first 4 parameters send general information to Universal Analytics. Also, along with every hit, there's data being sent to Universal Analytics about the device the user is using to browse the website. The first parameter in this category is UL and stands for user language. This specifies the language of the user's browser settings. Next parameter is SR, which specifies the screen resolution of the device. And the last parameter I'm going to mention here is SD and stands for screen depth. This parameter represents the color depth of the device. And these three parameters send information about the system to Universal Analytics. Then you'll also find information about the content, and the first parameter is DL, which stands for document location and represents the full URL of the page on which the content resides. The next parameter is DP, which stands for document path. The information of this parameter represents the path portion of the page URL. And the last content-related parameter is DT, which stands for document title. As the name implies, this represents the title of the page. And these three parameters sent to Universal Analytics fall under the category Content Information. You will also find information about the user, which is contained in the parameter CID. This represents the client ID and identifies the browser instance. If you want to know more about client ID, please watch the video about users from this video series. And last but not least, the most important parameter is T, which specifies the type of hit itself. And this hit type indicates the interaction and therefore which metrics and dimensions will be populated in Universal Analytics. So you now know that hits are sent to Google Analytics endpoint together with additional data. Hits will increment or calculate metrics or simply add numeric values from the parameters which have been transferred with a hit. So hits will populate metrics with values. And also, hits will store the alphanumeric values from the parameters of the hit in dimensions and therefore populate dimensions with values. The dimensions which will always be populated with values by default, regardless of the hit type, are page, screen resolution, screen colors, browser, operating system, language, and some others. Also worth knowing is that hits can also send data to populate custom definitions like custom dimensions and custom metrics by sending them as a parameter along with the hit. Now let's have a closer look what is meant by different hit types which will populate metrics and impact dimensions. So when you send an interaction hit of the type pageview to Universal Analytics, the following metrics will be populated: users, sessions, page views, entrances, page per session, and unique page views. Also, the following dimensions will be impacted: page title and previous page path. And since there are 7 different hit types available, I will briefly introduce them to you now. So the next interaction hit type is called event and is used to send data regarding events to Universal Analytics. This hit type must not be mixed up with the events in GA4. As you already know, there are 2 ways that you can track e-commerce data on your website. Either with standard e-commerce, which sends data with a transaction hit and item hits, or with enhanced e-commerce, which sends data through page view hits or event hits. When using standard e-commerce, transaction hits will populate the following metrics and dimensions which are all related to e-commerce. In conjunction with transactions, you will most likely also send data about the products which have been purchased with a particular transaction. And this data is sent to Universal Analytics by so-called item hits. The interaction hit types mentioned here are the most used ones, but there are 3 additional hit types available which are not quite often used. So let's have a look at the interaction hit type social, which requires a custom setup to be implemented. These types of hits are used for the social reports in Google Analytics. Next is the timing hit, which also requires a custom setup to be implemented. Hits of this type will be used for the user timing reports. And the last interaction hit type I'm going to cover here is called exception and helps to track crashes and errors that occur on your website. And for the sake of completeness, there's a legacy interaction hit type to be mentioned, which is called screen view. But since Google has shut down mobile SDK within Universal Analytics back in 2018, it doesn't make sense to track hits of this type anymore. So using interaction hit types for Universal Analytics makes it easier to send data to Google Analytics because you are restricted or limited to these hit types. And therefore, you know what data is being sent to Universal Analytics and Google Analytics knows where to store the incoming data by populating the right metrics and dimensions. But this also limits the amount of data to be sent to Universal Analytics due to those restrictions. That being said, let's have a look at how data is being sent and stored in GA4. To have a closer look at the anatomy of a hit for GA4, simply click on the line containing v equals 2, and you will also find the request URL in the tab headers. Below there's also the request method displayed, which in this case is post instead of get, and thus reveals another difference between Universal Analytics and GA4. And switching to the tab payload will then show all parameters line by line. So let's have a closer look at the parameters for Google Analytics 4. Like for Universal Analytics, the protocol version is also represented by the parameter v in GA4. But the main difference, like already mentioned before, is that the value now is 2. Next is the tracking ID, which is represented by the parameter TID and always starts with G- followed by an alphanumeric string. So all data being collected will be associated with this particular ID then. A new parameter which comes along with GA4 is _s. It is used as a hit counter and represents all hits for the current page load. These three parameters send general information to GA4. The next two parameters are already known from Universal Analytics. First is UL, which stands for user language and specifies the language of the user's browser settings, and the second is SR, which specifies the screen resolution of the system being used. Please note that there is no more parameter SD, which has sent information about the screen color depth. Since today all devices have a minimum color depth of 24-bit, there's no need to distinguish those anymore. So these remaining two parameters send information about the system to GA4. Like for Universal Analytics, you will also find information about the content, and the first parameter again is DL and stands for document location, while the second parameter is DT and stands for document title. Please note that the parameter DP, which stands for document path, has gone. This is because GA4 determines the document path automatically and displays it as page path within the reports. That being said, the remaining two parameters send content information to GA4. Then, like for Universal Analytics, you will find the same information about the client ID in the parameter CID. Again, if you want to know more about client ID, please watch the video about users from this video series. And unlike in Universal Analytics, GA4 now provides detailed information about the session of a user with the following parameters. First of all, there's the session ID represented by the parameter SID and comes from the GA4 cookie. Next is the parameter SCT, which specifies the session count, and therefore the number of sessions recorded in GA4 for this particular user. The value will be incremented by 1 each time a new session is started. Then there's the parameter SEG, which stands for session engaged. This is a Boolean value which is either 0 for not engaged or 1 for engaged. And the last session-related parameter in this example is _SS, which stands for session start. If its value is 1, a new session has been started. And these four parameters will send information about the current session to GA4. And last but not least, another important parameter is EN, which specifies the event name and therefore indicates if it's one of the predefined events or if it's a custom event. So now you know that, like for Universal Analytics, also for GA4, hits are sent to the Google Analytics endpoint together with additional data. Hits will increment or calculate metrics or simply add numeric values from the parameters which have been transferred with the hit. So hits, again, will populate metrics with values. And also hits will store the alphanumeric values from the parameters of the hit in dimensions and therefore populate dimensions with values. The dimensions which will always be populated with the values by default are page, page title, screen colors, browser, operating system, and language. Also worth knowing is that hits can also send data to populate custom definitions like custom dimensions and custom metrics by sending them as event parameters along with the event. Parameters for custom dimensions will be indicated by using the prefix EP dot followed by the custom parameter name and can carry an alphanumeric value. Parameters for custom metrics, on the other hand, are indicated by using the prefix EPN dot followed by the custom parameter name. Their values can be of a numeric nature only. Now let's have a look at the different event hit types available in GA4. So when you send an event hit to GA4, the following types are available, which will then populate corresponding metrics and dimensions. The first event type is automatically collected events and collects several events and data for app and web, web only, and app only. These events are collected automatically when the tracking is involved. The second event type is the enhanced measurement and will be configured for each data stream for web in GA4. Once enabled, events for page view, scroll, click, on-site search, video interaction, and downloads are automatically tracked. And the next event type consists of recommended events. The events listed here as an extract are to be used when you want to track, for instance, e-commerce or registrations, etc. And if you need to send events to GA4 which are not available as one of the previous hit types, you can simply create your own custom events. With those, you can collect business-specific information and name them to your needs. But to be able to see them in the reports later, you will have to register them as custom events in GA4. So to sum up the differences between Universal Analytics and GA4 when it comes to comparing interaction hits and event hits, it's like this. In Universal Analytics, there are 7 predefined interaction types available, and unfortunately you are limited to them. And those interaction hits are sent to Google Analytics with a GET request. The appended parameters of the hit unfortunately don't carry information about session, conversion, engagement, or hit count, and also there's a hit limit of 10 million hits per month in property for the standard or non-paid version of Google Analytics. GA4, on the other hand, has more than 30 predefined event types, and you are eligible to also create your own events. Those event hits are sent to the Google Analytics endpoint by using the POST method, and they can carry a lot of information about session, conversion, engagement, and hit count. And last but not least, in GA4 there's no hit limit, which basically enables you to send as many event hits to the Google Analytics endpoint as you wish. As always, I hope this video was helpful, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one. And always keep in mind, experience cannot be learned, it must be gathered. Therefore, rely on the expert's experience only.